Okay, we're here with the Rimage Producer Suite. We're going to be looking at some settings for the basic settings for the production server. What you want to do is open up System Manager and then click on your production server and server settings. So there's a lot of tabs here, and you can look at everything. Really, there's only a few that are going to pertain to most users. So if you only have one system or a couple systems, the server tab you can pretty much ignore. The verify only mode is kind of handy. We'll go into that in another video. But otherwise, you can skip this tab altogether. Under recording, this will basically lets you choose your recording speeds. Most people, I would suggest checking the use new media only box. Most people are not re-recording on top of an open session disk, so you just want to know you're recording to a blank disk. This will make the system reject any disk that isn't blank, so you won't have any issues with recording on top of other disks if you leave them open. Maximum recording speed for CD, DVD, and Blu-ray. It's kind of debatable. Some people just run this at max to try to get the max speed. These are the settings that I usually recommend: 40x for CD, 8x for DVD. Primarily because if you're using a more budget media, sometimes running at 52x you'll see more fallout. Same thing with the DVDs. If you run at 16x, I've seen people who were running at 16x and they were getting a pretty good amount of fallout, 20%, 30% fallout. You reduce it to 8x and the fallout pretty much went away. They're getting no record failures. And the difference in speed wasn't huge. If it takes 6 minutes at 16x and 6.5 or 7 minutes at 8x, then that's the max speed, so it's not running at 16x the full time. That's just what it maxes out at. So it is spending most of its time around probably 8 or 10x, even if you have it set to 16x. So it's not going to be a huge jump in speed to do that. Same thing with the 40x versus 52x or max. So these are the settings I recommend for recording. Under printing, basically the one option that you can choose here that I tell most people about is this reject pattern. So on the Rimage system, you can have it print. It prints like stripes on the disk to tell you that it's a reject. You can have it go on all rejected disks, on record failures only, or disable. Most of my customers, if your system has a mail slot that goes out on the side, I have a lot of customers that use that as their reject bin. So if you want to do that, where your rejects are, just disable it. If disable this, it just leaves your disk blank. And there's really no problem with that. I mean, the stripe disk, it's easy to pick out, but also a blank disk, you can just call it bad. If you see a blank in the middle of your job, assume that one's bad. So disabling will basically just save you a little bit of time. It doesn't have to print those stripes. Also save you some money because it doesn't use any ribbon to print on those stripes. A couple other things you can choose here. Pick up orders with labels even if printer's offline. So that's kind of, you don't really want your job to be processed if it can't be printed. So I usually tell people don't bother checking that. And don't pick up orders if low number of print remains. I suppose this could be handy if you have a high volume of orders coming through, but you're really putting a lot of trust on the print counts. So the print count's not always accurate. So I pretty much just say, look, keep in mind how many prints are left on your ribbon when you send a job. Because I think most people would rather their 200 disc job get started rather than not start because it doesn't have enough prints left in there. So under autoloaders, I pretty much don't have anything checked in here. The main things to look at are recording, like we'd mentioned, printing, verify. Verify is basically it's going to go back and reread the copies, compare them against the master image, the temporary image that's saved. So to enable it, you just click enable, and then you can tell to verify every disk, every two, whatever number you want. Typically, I would tell people to enable it and do it at least every 10th disk. And that just kind of keeps your hardware honest, because we've seen some weird fluke things where the disks are failing for whatever reason. They're burning, they're not failing during the record, but they're not readable in the end. And if you have verification enabled, you would at least get that red flag that you would see failed verify. You know, if you see it failing verify, that's kind of a red flag that, hey, we need to go back and check every disk, because we have seen that happen where a complete run of disks was bad, but you know, they didn't have verify on at all, so there was really no indication. So that's a handy thing to have. Like, do it at least, I would say, 10%. If time is not an issue, because it does take time to go back and reread the whole disk, I would say do it every disk, and you know, you've got them 100% burned, 100% verified. This email tab is kind of nice. You can set this up if you put your email in here. You can have it email you with order completion, any error dialogues, and any alerts. So the alerts could be out of blank disks, or even it'll tell you if the door was opened and closed. The errors, of course, are going to be, you know, if there was a problem picking, problem printing, anything like that. And then order completion is obviously when an order is done. So this can really fill up your email box quickly if you do a lot of jobs, or if you have a lot of people opening and closing the doors. So something to play around with, but this is handy if you have, especially if you have one big job that's going to be running overnight and you want a heads up on whether or not it's finishing or if there's a problem, because it is nice to get an email. You can look and say, oh, it ran out of disk, ran out of ribbon, or it just jammed, and then you can possibly log on and look at it, or, you know, run back to the system and clear what needs to be cleared. We'll go over the setting up the email completely in another video, but that's what that email tab is about. For the most part, that's all I really tell people about. Under caching, most Rimage systems are set up with a RAID for cache, so you don't have to worry about this static caching. These checkboxes here, overlap recording with download to cache. Basically what that means is it's going to start recording while it's still downloading the image to cache. Typically, I would not check this, because your first disk is going to come out faster, but it's also going to, you know, give you a possibility of having a failure if it's not able to, you know, feed the recorder with data as fast as, you know, it's downloading. So depending on where the data is stored, how fast it can get to the cache, you may have an issue there. So if you uncheck that, it's got to download completely. It takes a little bit longer to get that first disk out, but you limit your risk of losing that first disk. Same thing with image streaming. Image streaming is basically where it's going to record directly from the site where the image is saved. And I usually disable that. You're relying a lot on hard drive speed, relying a lot on the network speed, and just overall it just seems a lot more robust and reliable to let it download completely to local cache and burn from there. So that's why this is how the setup I usually have. Uncheck the overlap and check the disable streaming. Reading, if you're reading in from your if you're reading in disks for copying, you can choose if you want to use the recorders or the readers. Most systems, like if you have a 3410, 3400, you know, something with an external PC, 2000i, then you do have the option to use your CD DVD readers. Historically, from my experience, recording from a reader, it seems a lot slower, sometimes significantly slower than reading from the recorders. And I've never really understood why, but I mean, I found, especially with DVDs, it would take 30 minutes to read in a DVD from the reader, but if I read it in on a recorder, it takes, say, 4 or 5 minutes. So keep that in mind. It's handy to do it from the computer if you have an external computer, but for the most part, it seems like it's more reliable and faster if you use the recorders for reading in. And for this audio read speed, you can just adjust if you want to slow it down when you're reading in an audio disc, and that's pretty much the only settings that we look at from a basic standpoint when setting up a new system. So once you get these dialed in, there's really not much changing you'll need to do, and you can leave this whole settings alone. So that's the production server settings on the Rimage Producer Suite.